Okay, today I'm going to talk about the 12 steps of yeast bread production, and then we're going to make some French bread loaves. I'm going to go over a PowerPoint quickly with you. A lot of you might already know this information, but I just want to recap. So let me get to this is chapter 31 out of your professional cooking book if you're interested in looking up the recipes or anything that has to do with that. Understanding yeast products, regular yeast dough products. You have your lean dough, which are low in fat and sugar, and your rich doughs like croissants, pastries, which are higher in fat and sugar because you're constantly putting in butter and melting those in through the doughs. You have your rolled-in dough or laminated doughs. That's your fats incorporated with the doughs, many layers. Again, that's croissants. When we get to that point, you make croissants. You're actually folding butter in with the dough, and then you put it in the refrigerator and let it firm up, and then you're folding more butter in. So if you always wonder why your croissants are so very flaky, it's because there's more butter than there actually is flour. You're mixing your yeast dough products. We have our large mixers there. We'll be using the smaller standard mixer to distribute the yeast, the flour, the water, and the salt. French bread is one of my favorite recipes because it is only 4 ingredients. The 3 principal mixing methods. We have the straight dough method, which is what we're going to be using. You have the modified straight dough method, and then the sponge method. And we'll get into those a little bit farther as the class progresses. So your 12 steps of yeast dough production are the scaling of the ingredients. That's where obviously your mise en place comes in. Mixing everything together. Bulk fermentation, depending on what you're baking, bulk fermentation could go anywhere from an hour to 2 hours, especially if it's an artisan's bread, so sometimes the bulk takes a little while. Your folding or your punching. I don't like to use the word punching, I call it folding because you don't technically punch your bread. An instructor that I worked for at one time used to tell us, treat your dough like a baby. We don't punch our babies, we fold our babies. So I was trying to remember that. Your dough is your baby, don't punch it. And then scaling or portioning the dough, the sizes of the loaves or the rolls that you want. And then we'll round them. That's to get them into basically the shape that's ready to make up. You round them, we set them to bench for a little while longer. This helps the gluten to form a skin over the bread dough to give it a little bit more of elasticity. And then we'll do our makeup and panning. I'm going to do some 12-inch baguettes that everybody will get a chance to roll one up and try. Baking, obviously that's a given. We put it in the oven, it's baked off. There's not much that we do at that point. And then cooling and storing. One of the things about baguettes is when you take them out, they have to immediately come out of the baguette pans and then get cooled on a table. So that's always one thing you need to remember because those pans are so hot that the heat retains and you don't want your bread to overcook. And then of course storing it. I don't know why you want to store fresh bread. You should eat it right away, but some people will, and that's just wrapping it and making a presentation style so it looks good when you want to hand somebody a freshly wrapped bread. The steps in yeast production, again, we scale the ingredients. Everything must be weighed accurately. The only items that are weighed by volume are milk, water, and eggs. Everything else is weighed by measurement. Mixing, we have the 2-purpose mixing methods. Use the dough arm attached. Why do we use a dough arm or a hook? Does anybody have any idea why you would use a hook instead of a whip or a paddle? Because the dough arm is the closest thing to a human hand, so it keeps the dough moving. If you were to do a whip, obviously you're going to get all that bread dough in the whip. The paddle doesn't give it that movement that you have with the hand, so that's why we use the hook or the bread dough. You don't want to overmix or undermix. That's really hard, and it's basically just a hit or miss when you're trying with bread. I've made so many loaves. I've had some that over-rose, some that didn't. And then your bulk fermentation. This is the process where the yeast acts on the sugars and the starches to create the carbon dioxide, the gas, and the alcohol. So this is where the gluten becomes smoother, more elasticity happens during the fermentation. You're able to stretch the dough, work with it a little bit more. Your under-fermented dough is called a young dough. It means it wasn't actually fermented long enough. It's not going to get the full volume or rise. And then your over-fermented dough is an old dough. It's basically too risen during the fermentation process. So when you go to proof it, you're not going to get any more rise. Your loaves are going to kind of stay flat and not have much life to them. dividing or portioning. I call it portioning. That's where we're going to get a scale. You get your little dough hook, no, pastry slicer, thank you, and you're going to portion it out on the scale. Like I said, we're going to do 12-inch loaves, and then we'll round those out. Shaping or rounding is where you're going to take it all, make it smooth. There's a technique that we'll use on the table that you're taking your thumb and you're tucking it up underneath the roll. So basically when you flip it over, you should look like you have a little tiny belly button on the bottom of the roll. And that's how you know that you've actually got it shaped properly to start out. So then you're shaping the roll, you let it sit there for a few minutes, and this is what we call benching. After you've got your portions and you've rounded it, you set it on the table and line it up, and basically I cover it with a piece of plastic wrap, and then that's where the loop is going to take another form of shaping over the dough. It gets a little bit of a hard crust on there. When I started first doing this, I got panicky. So I'm like, oh my gosh, my dough went sour, got ruined, but actually you want it to build up that crust because that's the gluten actually taking form and being happy with the rest of the dough. Oops. Too fast. Proofing, again, after we've made up, let me go back, I'm sorry, I skipped too far. So we're going to make up the dough, and that's where I'm taking the pieces of the dough. We're going to roll it with the rolling pin, and then I'm going to show you the technique for rolling them and tucking them, and then making your baguette loaves. And then we put them on the pans for proofing. And that time you already have your finished loaf. It's already been scored, and now it just sits on the trays to roll a little bit more, get a little bit more growth in it before we put it into the oven, and then we go to the baking part. Oven spring is one thing that you really want to be aware of. That's the rapid rising of the oven due to the production and expansion of the trapped gases. If this happens, your bread will not rise properly. It won't mean it won't taste bad, but it'll be very, very dense, so it's not good to have. Let's try to avoid oven spring. And then, of course, the browning and the formation of the crust is the important thing. You can tell by when you knock on the bread if the crust has been done. It says lean breads are baked at 400 to 425 degrees. We have a convection oven here, so we always bake things at 25 degrees less than what it says because our convection ovens run a lot hotter than regular ovens. So that's one thing that I did a little bit of a test on this morning. Again, like I said earlier, you remove the breads right away from the baguette pans, and then we place them onto a rack to cool, or I just actually put them onto the cutting board to cool. You keep them out of a drafty area because it can cause the bread to crack. Bread must be served within 8 hours left on the racks. Everybody knows this if you work in the industry. You can't put food out on the line any longer. I mean, it's 4 hours really, but bread, I think, because of the crust. You can store it wrapped up, and it can stay in the freezer, refrigerator or freezer for indefinite periods of time, depending on how well it's been wrapped and stored. All right, so that was basically just a real quick PowerPoint on the 12 steps of yeast bread production. I have already got a mise en place ready to go, so we'll take a few minutes. I want you to look over the chapter on the bread production, and then we'll start with the mise en place after that. So I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to take a break and read over the terms and the text. Thank you.
Action.
Okay, so I have the mise en place right here. Like I said, French bread is really easy. We've got the 4 ingredients. I've got 3 pounds of bread flour, 28 ounces of water, 1 ounce of salt, and 1.5 ounces of yeast. And first of all, Cassie is going to be the student that's going to work this for me. Cassie, can I get you to add the yeast in with the water? The yeast in with the water. And the reason we do this is you want the yeast to fully be dissolved in the water before adding it into the salt, or we get a very strange reaction. Go ahead and give it just a little bit of a mix. It doesn't always dissolve. It's going to kind of sit on the top of the surface, but that's okay. We just need it in there with the water to start the activation process. So at this point, we're going to use the dough arm, or the hook, as I said before. It's the next thing to a human hand. So we'll put the bowl up on here, get it locked into place. And I'm a little vertically challenged, so I'm doing the best I can here. All right, lock it in. And then Cassie, if I can have you add in the 3 pounds of bread flour. Go ahead and add in the salt, and then Go ahead and lift up the mixer, close it. We'll give it just a little mix around with the salt and flour. Have a happy marriage. Get to know each other in there before we add the water and the yeast. Start the hop. Is it on number? Put it on to number 1, so we want to start on the lowest setting. There. Safety. It locks all the way so we don't stick our hands in there and end up with a arm like a dough hook. It's already run out of time, so what we want to do is stop it and then just ask it to go on for another 2 minutes. Oh, exactly. So it's just going to mix up there a little bit, make the salt happy with the flour, and then I'm going to have you add in the yeast and the water mixture in just 1 second. So if you want to slowly start pouring this in through the hopper there, and then we get everything all happy and incorporated. If you have happy ingredients, you will have happy bread. So this is what we're trying for. It is a slow process baking. There's a lot of downtime, so it's a lot of hurry up, mix things, get it all together, and then wait. So always want to try to keep yourselves busy. There's always something to clean. There's always something to do. Maybe give it a little swirl at the bottom. Make sure there's no yeast stuck in the bottom of the jug. Good job. As Cassie's doing, we add the liquid in slowly, so that it doesn't all clump in at one time because the dough hook is mixing everything around. So the slower we add the water in, the more it's going to incorporate nicely. If need be, we can always stop it, and then you can scrape that into the mixer as well. So the rest of the yeast is getting put in there. It's very, very important that you get all the yeast in there, even though it seems like it's difficult to get out of there. If you don't, the bread won't form or rise properly. Go ahead and scrape down the sides while you're in there. We'll mix it on low speed until all the ingredients are incorporated, and then we put it on to the second speed for about 2 minutes. The gluten will start to develop at that time, and then we're going to remove it, and then we do the rest of it by hand. All incorporated nicely. Got to stand on my tiptoes as I am a little shorter than the average person in this kitchen. Can anybody tell me what gluten is? What you use gluten for? It's found in a lot of products. All of our wheat products, our rye, everything has gluten in it. I'm going to tell you what gluten is, and then I'm going to ask you later to tell me. So what is gluten? Gluten is a composite of storage of proteins termed prolamins and glutenins. These are found in wheat and related grains like barley, oat, rye, and other specified hybrids of wheat. The reason the gluten has a lot of viscoelasticity properties, which means it becomes very elastic, almost like elastic in your dress or your shorts. And it's still incorporating. Let's take a little bit of time to get this all in there. If you more minutes and then we can move up the speed to the second level. Again, thank you for helping me, Cassie. It is a lot of standing around and waiting and looking. Second speed, we always want to shut the mixer off. You never want to change gears. It's just like your car. You don't, if you're driving a manual speed, you don't go from first to second without pushing in the clutch. We always stop the machine and move it to the second gear. And we're going to do this for about 2 minutes on the second speed. And this will help the glutens to form a little bit more. You can see it's moving a little faster. It'll become a happy dough instead of a scattered mess in there. So seems like the dough hook is angry because it's moving things around, but if it didn't do that, we wouldn't have bread. Stand that for a second. I'm going to get the bowl so we can put that in. All right, the dough has been finished mixing for the 2 minutes, so we're going to remove it now from the big mixer and put it out onto the table and actually work it by hand.
Go.
Cassie, can you go ahead and remove the bowl? And then we're going to put it over on the table, and then we're going to knead this for a few minutes. Thank you. All right, we're just going to put a little flour on the table just to prevent it from sticking. And then go ahead and turn the bowl out, put the dough out on top of there. I am going to show you quickly the kneading method, and then I'm going to have you do this.
Oh.
So basically, I always learned to do kneading as if I was doing CPR. So you want to give it a quarter of a turn. I push it in, and then I'm pumping the heart. Quarter of a turn. So basically, you're helping the gluten to form a little bit more into the bread. Pick up all your pieces as you go around. It looks like it might be dry, but that's just the gluten is actually fighting us at this point. It doesn't want to adhere to the conditions that we're putting it through. So get this formed a little bit, and then I'm going to let you take over. So it might be a little easier. You're a couple inches taller than me, so you might have a little bit more height. But I kind of put one foot back and one behind me, and I sort of do a rocking motion and giving it a little bit of a turn. CPR, quarter turn, another CPR. So why don't you get your hands in there and try it out and see. It is not easy to work with bread, so thank goodness for the guy who invented the bread making machine. Artisans are still out there making bread by hand, and this is the way they would do it. If you were actually making an artisan bread, such as like a sourdough or something, you wouldn't actually even use a mixer. It would all be done by hand. You'd mix everything in with your hands. That's the term of artisan, because we're creating something. And yes, bread is a piece of art. I'm in culinary, and anything I make, I consider that art. If I was a photographer and I take pictures, that would be art. But you need to be proud of the food that you make. After you knead this for a few minutes, what we're going to do is we're going to look for what I call a window, and that's where we take a piece of dough and we're going to stretch it. If you stretch it too far and it rips, it means the gluten hasn't formed properly. We want to stretch it and be able to kind of look through it. You won't see it through like I'm looking through a window, but you can see a transparency without it ripping. So it's kind of a neat little term. I don't know what the actual technical term is that's called. I like calling it the window. I don't think there is a technical term, is there? Autolays. That's right. I like to call it getting the window. It makes it easy for me to remember. All right, so let's try. What we're going to do is pull off just a little chunk of the bread, and I'm going to kind of spread it apart and move it with my fingers and index fingers here, just to see how far I can stretch it without it ripping. I see it's still pulling apart. So the gluten hasn't formed properly, so we need to give it a few more minutes of kneading. And like I said, for some reason, wheat we use almost everything we eat, but gluten wants to always fight you back. It wants to resist you turning it into something else. And you can see the more as she's kneading the bread, the appearance is becoming softer and smoother. So that means the gluten is actually starting to work with us and not against us. It makes it nice. Like I said, it's your happy bread dough that will turn into a happy loaf. We're going to be forming these into baguettes. And just a little bit of history, a baguette was actually in the early 1920s was when it received its name. Before then, people were just making a stick of bread and didn't really have a name to it. A Frenchman came out with this loaf that didn't actually look like a normal loaf of bread. It was skinnier, it was smaller, it was a little bit harder, and I guess they said, we're going to call this a baguette because it's not a normal size. It's really good. The traditional baguettes, you will see, don't come out straight like a normal loaf like you would get in a store because they make those all in the machine. The artisan's way or a hand making of a baguette will be curvy, it will be misshapen. It's all about the taste. When you eat a piece of bread, you want it to taste good. You don't really care what it looks like as long as it's warm and the butter melts.
Going.
Let's try to see if we can get a window again. It looks really good. Let's put this over. One thing about baking is it is forgiving. Everything is measured, but if you've got too much water, you can add a little flour. You've got too much flour, you add a little water. So things can always be worked out to help. You can see as we're stretching, it's still ripping just a little. Let's try one more time. Might have too big of a chunk of bread too here in the dough. Just a little bit more. The window is almost there, but we just want to give it a little bit more extra leaven. It's okay to use terms like that in culinary. You certainly couldn't go into the auto program and say you wanted to put a little extra leaven in your car, but you can when you're baking or when you're cooking. All right, try this happy dough one more time, see if we can get a window from this, and we can move on to the next step. What I'm doing is I'm spreading the dough to try to find that transparency, and it looks like we have achieved a window. Okay. So if you can see, it's really light right there, but it's not ripping. Well, it rips when you pull it too hard, but so what's saying is the gluten is staying together in the form that we have asked it to do so. So it's willing to work with us now instead of against us. So at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to put the dough into our prepared bowl, which has been sprayed with some cooking spray. And then we're going to cover it with some plastic wrap. And then we put this in the oven to proof for about 1 to 1.5 hours, depending on the size of the volume that you're looking for. I usually check about an hour, and then if I want a little bit more lift, I'll wait and give it another half hour, especially with French bread. So at this point, we are going to put this in the oven. You can use a proofer, you can use an oven, you can use any warm area, just as long as if it's going to be out, you need to cover it because it does need to stay dark. So I usually will put it in an empty oven that we're not using, covering it with plastic wrap to keep the gases and everything in here. And then the dark oven helps to create the rise that we need. So we're going to put it in the oven for bulk fermentation. Okay, so I've removed the dough from the oven. As you can see, it's doubled in size. It's a nice little happy dough. I'm going to remove this, and then I'm going to do what we call the folding or the punching. And I don't know why they call it punching, because like I said, you don't punch the dough. You're going to take the dough from the sides, bring it over, and fold it into the middle. Bring it around. Same thing on this side, over here, that's punching or folding the dough. And you're going to pick it up and you just invert it into the pan that way. And once we do this, now we're ready to portion it to the sizes that we want. So we want 12-ounce sizes for the baguettes. Do I have a volunteer that might want to help me do some portioning?
Yes, I would like to volunteer.
Wes, please come up. That would be awesome. Thank you. So what we're going to do is just do them in 12 ounces.
Okay.
And here's your dough.
And why do we do 12 ounces?
12 ounces is standard for a standard baguette loaf. You can also do round loaves. There are some people that use the French bread to make a round loaf or small little bread rolls. I use a standard 12 ounce to make a nice long thin stick of baguette. You could make them smaller if you want to. You can make them 5 inches if you want to make little sandwiches. And Wes has a technique. He's already looked at the dough and sized it up and said, I'm going to quarter it and then see how we go from there. That's very smart. I would have started just hacking at the end and putting it on the scale. So a little bit of organization there from a student, which I like.
Too much.
Probably going to get about 6 12-ounce loaves by the time we look. So we can do like 11.5 ounces, something like that, to make sure we get even.
Okay. And what really makes a baguette like its own type of bread?
It's the size of the baguette when you're rolling it. It's the rustic look that it has when it comes out. Normally, a baguette, when you make it, it's not going to be completely round like a loaf you get in the store. It's going to have its own unique shape and size, and that's the rustic feel of the artisan part of the bread making.
Okay. A little bit short.
As long as we get them all about even, we can even do 10-ounce loaves. We just want to make sure that, regardless of the size of the bread rolls or the loaves you make, you want to make sure that they're all the same size so you bake evenly. If you have one loaf that's 12 ounces and one that's 8, of course that 8-ounce loaf is going to cook more. It's going to be tougher to cut into. The bread might even burn. So you really want to make sure that if you don't have enough to do 12 ounces, at least break your dough up into even portions. So if you have 10.5 ounces, you have 10.5 ounce rolls or loaves. And then after we do the scaling portion, then we're going to do the rounding and the benching. So it's kind of almost like one fluid motion. We weigh, we round, and then we put on the table to bench.
Okay.
And then benching, we just kind of leave it alone
Got putting it off on the bench.
there. Exactly. It's been timed out on the bench. You can smell the yeast from the dough. I don't know, I love the smell. Not maybe some people don't, but I love the way the dough smells, the yeasty smell of the dough.
You know it's active then.
Yes, and you look forward to it, you know, oh my gosh, it's going to smell so good when it starts to bake. Almost done scaling. We might have a little left over at the end. You can always make a smaller little loaf and you have to put that off in a separate pan. We don't want it to bake at the same time. Or we can incorporate it all with the rest of it.
Okay. So we got 2, 11, 7.
So what he's doing is he's going to try to make everything and take the rest of the little pieces of dough that are there and break it out so we can kind of get even loaves and we don't end up throwing anything away. You don't want to waste if we can avoid doing that. Nobody likes to waste food at home, and why do we want to waste it here when we're in the kitchen? Just because we're in class doesn't mean we throw things away.
Waste not, want not.
From the mouths of babes. Got a student who's very persnickety about being his weights, which I like.
I just want to make sure that they all come out roughly the same.
Why is that? Because if they weren't the same size, they wouldn't cook evenly or bake evenly, and then you would have some bread that might be doughy in the inside and some that might be too done. Although I love bread, it's one of my weaknesses. You throw some butter on a hot piece of bread, I will eat it even if it's toasted brown.
Bread basically goes almost with anything. I mean, you got soups, I mean, you got entrees.
I don't know if
bread pudding?
I grew up in a household where there was a loaf of bread and a stick of butter on the table every night. My grandpa had to have his loaf of white Weber's bread and his stick of butter and his gallon of milk. And I remember just growing up with there was always a loaf of bread on the table. So the bread is the American staple, I think. I love the man who invented the sliced bread. All right. Got a little bit more to break up there, and then we can start the other process. Triple checking his weights. Make sure he's got everything good.
All right.
Good job. Thank you, Wes. All right, he's got everything all scaled out, so now what we're going to do is the rounding portion. And what we do, we take each piece of dough, and you're kind of turn it into a ball of sorts. I usually like to take it and kind of give it a smooth top, take all of this on the bottom, and bring it together. Nice little lump. And what we're going to do is round it. These are a little bit big. Normally you can do it with one hand, but my hands are a little small, so I'm going to do it with two hands. And basically what you're doing is when you're moving it, you're taking your bottom fingers, or if you could do it with your thumb, you're tucking in that dough as you're smoothing it to basically round it out and to develop what I like to call a little belly button on the bottom. So if you've got your belly button, then you've done a good job. Rounded it out. And you look, you can see it still needs a little bit more, but it's forming together, so it's a nice area here. I'm going to give it just a little bit more of a pinch to kind of help it along. And just round it a little bit more. You see, I try the one-handed method, but these cloves are a little bit too big for my hands. So we're going to work them in, tuck it in. Okay, and you've got a small little belly button. And then we're going to move this over here, and it's going to sit there until we get the rest of it done, and then we will put them onto bench for just a few minutes. The reason we bench is when I said went over in the PowerPoint is to help develop almost like a skin on the outside of the bread loaf. This is the gluten actually doing more of its gluten business, forming the skin to help the dough retain its elasticity.
And why do we want to make sure that happens?
That the dough retains its elasticity?
Yes.
So when you go to roll it out, it's not fighting you. If you've ever taken like a poppin' fresh pizza dough that you buy in the grocery store that's already made, and you pop the tube open and you roll it out, if you've ever tried to roll that dough out, it always wants to spring back. It's always fighting you. You're rolling it out and it's shrinking back up. It's because the gluten has been retarded and it wants to battle you. So you're constantly working against it with doing it this way by hand. You're ensuring that the gluten is your friend. It knows that you want to make it successful, and it's not going to fight with you.
Unless it knows what it's good for.
I have found it easy to buy the poppin' fresh dough and to make things, but because it fights you so much, sometimes you take the few extra minutes and make it at home, make it fresh. Your family will appreciate it. Pizza dough isn't that hard to make. Once you learn how to work with the yeast, you kind of get a feel on how you can manipulate it, use the bread dough to your advantage. When I first started in culinary, I baked a lot of bread at home myself, and I made French bread and I would braid it. And I took the 3 strands and I'd make these really cool French braided French breads, and I'd sprinkle them with poppy seeds and sesame seeds and put butter on it and bake them. And when I started school, the the baking instructor says, you can't braid French bread. And I said, but I've done it, so I don't understand why you can't. There's no rule that says you can't turn a piece of bread into any dough into anything you want. We actually, sometimes we will take dough and make a basket out of it. It's bread you don't eat. So I think technically the bread that's supposed to be braided is a challah bread, which is a Amish bread. It's very good, very, very tasty, yummy to make French toast out of. But you can braid any kind of bread. It makes it look nice. It's nice for presentation. If you have family coming over and you want to make some bread for them, braid it. There's. All right. Well, Wes's hands are so much bigger than mine. He was able to finish his a lot quicker than I am. So I'm working on my last loaf here. And then we're going to cover them with a little bit of plastic wrap, and then I usually just throw my apron over them just to kind of keep it in a little dark area. So what we're doing is letting them bench here, and as I said before, it's going to cause a little bit of a crusty to come over the top of the bread or the dough before we roll it out. So we're going to cover this and let it set for a few minutes. And then we're going to clean up our mess that we've created by using the mixer and whatnot. We've got a lot of things that we need to start organizing. So we'll shut the camera down, do some cleanup, and then we'll be back and take care of these. All right, great. We are back now. We've cleaned everything up, and we didn't really need to videotape the cleaning of the kitchen because we all know what that is. I'm going to put my apron back on quickly, and then I have Brooke who's going to assist me, and now we are going to make up the loaves and pan them. So let me just 1 second try this on. I took my apron off to cover it over the rolls because if they stay kind of darker, or they will proof up a little bit faster. Okay, so I've got 2 rolling pins, and Brooke will assist me, and we're going to take a loaf each. So here's one for you, and one for me. And what we're going to do is we're just going to lightly roll this out into an oval. So usually I start in the middle and I'll roll down. Whatever technique works good for you. There's not really one way to do it versus another. I'm just going to kind of roll it into like a long oval. Once we get it that way. The gluten is going to fight with you a little bit. It is going to be tough to roll, so don't be afraid to push it down and tell it what you want it to do. As I said before, like with the pizza dough, the gluten's elasticity just wants to keep going back to I was a happy little ball. I want to stay that way. We want it to turn it into a happy little loaf. Okay, go ahead and turn it sideways, and then what we'll do is we'll just stretch it out to kind of finish it out. So you want to get it into kind of a nice square oval shape. We don't make it 12 inches here. What we'll do is we'll roll that out afterward. I like to start from the top. Some people go from the bottom. I usually start from the top and work my way down. What you're going to do is you're just going to take it over and you're going to pick it up and just kind of fold. And then tuck it in really, really tight. The reason we half turn and tuck, the reason we do this with the tucking is to alleviate holes in the bread. If you've ever gotten a loaf of bread and all of a sudden through the middle of your loaf there's a big giant hole, butter leaks through that. What we try to do here is we're avoiding doing that by tucking these in and pinching them down really tight. And this is a technique that was developed back in 1922 and it's not been changed. So apparently if it works, we don't have to fix it. Keep tucking and rolling, small little portions. It is a learning process. So what I do is I get it all the way to the end, and then I'm going to pinch the seam together into the dough. Try to keep the seam all in one area because the seam is where your dough tends to split when it's baking. So if you can kind of keep it together, your seam will all be on the bottom, and then you put it bottom side down on the pan. So I have a pinched loaf that I finished, and now I'm going to just give it a nice roll. I put the seam side down, and I'm going to roll it out onto the counter just to kind of give it its length. And as you can see, I start from the middle, just kind of give it a firm roll, and pushing out towards the end. And you can see the baguette is growing. When I get to the desired length, then I'm going to just tuck in the ends, and I just stick my finger in there, just kind of tuck it through, to kind of make a nice little finished edge. Give it a little roll, make sure it's all evened out. Find your seam, very important to find your seam, and then you place the seam bottom side down on your special baguette pan. And this is what a baguette pan looks like. It has holes all through it. That way the bread cooks from underneath, and the baguette will develop little tiny bubbles on the bottom. So if you've ever went to the bakery and got a baguette and couldn't figure out why it had those bubbles on there or that texture, that's because of the type of pan they use when they bake those. So go ahead, don't be afraid, roll it out, make it tight. Dough is very forgiving. You can mess it up. If you mess that up, you just can put it back in a ball and start over again. So once it's got to this point, it could be forgiving, and it lets us work with it a little bit more. Just let it roll. And this, depending on how many loaves you make, could take you anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour. I guess if you're mass producing baguettes, it can be there for a while.
I'm going to pause just for a sec.
Okay. So Brooke has finished hers. Very nice. Seam side down. And Brooke, if you want to pick that up and then place it right on the baguette pan, that seam side down. And then we'll continue on getting these loaves made, get them in the oven, and show you a finished product. Get some butter afterward. Just put some butter on these nice baguettes and enjoy ourselves. Rolling pins. They are round. They do roll. Like I said, there's one way to do the baguette, the rolling, but some people will start at the top, some start at the bottom. I do what's comfortable for me. If it's comfortable for you to start at the bottom, as long as you end up with the same method, finished product at the end, the road to getting there is the only part. I'm going to roll this out again, keeping the seam side down, smoothing it out, and then pushing with my hands from the middle all the way out to the end to form that nice long baguette. The difference between a baguette and a typical French bread that you would buy at the store is that French bread is going to be very soft with a softer crust and basically a softer inside. It's like eating a white sandwich bread. The baguette is going to have a hard, crusty, rustic feel to it, and it'll be a little bit more crunchier or firmer of a bread inside. That's made to hold up soups. A lot of people will use French bread baguettes to make hors d'oeuvres or appetizers. You can put tapenade on top of them, bruschetta, a little bit of sliced tomato, and some mozzarella with some balsamic and a little basil, and oh my gosh, you got a happy little piece of bread. And I'm making myself hungry. Tends to happen when you're in culinary. That's why I never wanted to go into auto, because you can't eat a car, but you can certainly eat your bread when you finish. So, as you can see, as I put them on the pan, they do again start to shrink up. That gluten is fighting with us, but we've got them to the desired length that we want, so we're not going to worry about stretching those out again. And Brooke, you're doing really well for your first time.
Thank you.
It is something that will improve over time. You start to learn how to do it, and then if you enjoy making bread, it becomes second nature. You know what to do. The steps are really easy. You can tell by the smell of it when it's been fermented. Can you smell the yeast coming off of the bread? I love that smell. I think I've already said that earlier, but I love to bake. Don't get me wrong, I love to cook as well, but my heart is in baking. I love to make candy, bread, sweets, muffins. Christmas, I took a pizza dough and actually made a breakfast, like a breakfast cannoli, breakfast calzone. I mixed some scrambled eggs and cheese and tater tots, bacon, sausage, threw it all up into that nice pizza dough, rolled it up, baked it in the oven. Oh my gosh, it was so delicious. There are so many things you can do with bread dough, pizza dough, French bread dough. Don't be afraid to experiment. All right, so we've completed all of our dough making, our panning. We have only 5 spots on the baguette pan. I'm going to just turn around and make this, just do a small round loaf. I don't want to get out a whole nother pan. It won't bake evenly if you put it on one baguette on a baguette pan by itself. So we'll just put that happy little loaf on a pan. What we're going to do right now is I'm going to do what they call scoring. We have this special little tool. It's a double blade, razor blade, very, very sharp, so you're really careful when you use this. And what we're doing is we're just going to put very slightly marks into the bread. And you don't have to go very deep because this is a sharp blade. It automatically knows what to do.
Why do we score it?
It helps release the steam in the bread so it will bake evenly.
Oh.
And it also gives it a neat little look afterward when it's finished. So put that in there. Put your cap back on. There it is. Put that away because it's very, very sharp again. We always lock these up so students don't get them. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to score my little round loaf. I'm going to do a little crosshatch on this one just to kind of make it a little fun. A little design in there. So when it bakes, it'll kind of give it a neat little look. So at this point, what we do now is we put them on a rack, and they still have to proof for a little bit longer. We put them on a rack for about 15 minutes. They're covered, and they sit by the stove, so they gain the warmth, the heat from the stove, and they'll give a little bit more plumpness before they rise and we put them in the oven to bake. So we will do that portion, and then we will have a finished product. I'm so excited. Okay, now it's time to take the baguettes out of the oven. Ugh. Oh, they look so good. They smell nice. There's a nice crust on there. I don't know if you can hear it, but that sound telling you that it's done, and that's a nice crisp, good crust on there. As I said earlier, we want to remove them immediately from the baguette pan to stop any additional cooking that we have. So slide those on off there. And you can see the rustic look they get from hand rolling them versus coming out of the machine. So you can see they split a little bit. The scoring helped release some of the air. This was because they probably weren't rolled tight enough. It's a learning process. Everybody learns. You can see this one sort of looks like a leg. They all have their own shape, and that's why it's called a baguette, because no baguette is the same. They have that weird sort of rustic kind of just made fresh look. So the last part would be the cooling and storing, and as I said, I kind of combined those in. There's really 10 steps of yeast production. We're going to let these cool, and then we can either eat them or we'll wrap them up and take them home. So, all right, does anybody have any questions or anything on the final outcome of the bread or any of the process that I've done? No? Good. At this time, I'm going to give you a short little quiz. I appreciate if you take your time, answer the questions the best you can. It's not that difficult. It's basically everything we went over, almost the 12 steps of yeast production. Thank you very much.